Greetings there, everyone. For this video, I'd like to speak about the topic of transgender identity and the psychology and metaphysics that relate to this phenomenon. I know that this is a topic that has generated a lot of polarization and controversy in many areas of society, whether it's political or sociological or psychological. Many people have different ideas, different beliefs or viewpoints, various perspectives that in some way weigh in on this topic. And the approach that I'm taking to this is kind of a holistic, integrative approach that looks at this from multiple layers or levels of reality. So this is somewhat of a complex phenomenon that's not easy to narrow down to one particular narrow focus, in a sense. So we can't look at it only from a biological perspective, or only from a psychological, or only from a spiritual perspective. All those different layers are interrelated to one another. All of them play some role in terms of how we can look at this subject. Starting out with the spiritual layer, we can consider that we're all spiritual beings, and spirit is something that's essentially androgynous. So within our spiritual essence lies the potential for expression of both the feminine and masculine gender principles. So we all have within us, at that deepest level, both the masculine and feminine, both the male and female gender principle. So as that consciousness is coming down to experience physical reality, it has a variety of choices and options for what it may choose to experience. It could experience a hermaphroditic type of biological organism where the physical body itself expresses fully both polarities. Also, either specific gender could be chosen, so a body that expresses predominantly the male polarity or predominantly the female polarity. And of course there's biological, biochemical aspects to what's occurring in the body to manifest the expression of that particular gender. Then of course there's the psychological and social levels, where various psychological and social factors can to some extent influence or shape the way an individual identifies oneself. We can understand that the identity is always evolving in some way. Nothing has to be permanent. So we're constantly reprogramming our own consciousness, our own identity, and this can apply to every aspect of how we see or identify ourselves, not just gender or sexuality, but any other aspects of our identity. It may seem that some aspects are more kind of pre-programmed or locked in from a biological level, whereas others tend to be more flexible or malleable. But even qualities or characteristics that seem to have a strong biological component are also reprogrammable to some extent, at least. So there's a common phrase people have used that's born this way, to imply that we're born with the sort of predetermined gender orientation or sexual orientation, and that should just be 100% embraced and accepted as that is. And this is something that's not really as simple as that. So many people may be born with a particular propensity, but then later on other factors may take a predominance and their identity may shift based upon those other factors. And this isn't to say any particular identity is right or wrong. It's just about the reality of how consciousness continues to evolve and reprogram itself. So when we look at people who consider themselves to be transgender, to have been born in a physical body that's designed to express a particular gender polarity, while they psychologically identify with the other gender polarity, and in many cases seek to have physical treatments, operations, or hormone treatments to alter the physical to reflect or match the way they identify themselves psychologically. That's the phenomenon we're talking about. This is something that could occur with people at any age. So sometimes you'll find children who seem to identify themselves as the opposite gender of what their biological body seems to present. You may also find people who begin to experience this in adolescence, and also some people that start to embrace that type of identity further into their adult life. Of course, there's a lot of controversy of how to handle this when there's a child who's expressing this type of transgender sentiment, since there's the concern of whether this is really truly that child's permanent, stable identity, or perhaps just a phase they're going through, something they may outgrow or change from at a later point. And then it's a question of who gets to decide whether a child has medical treatments. Can that child decide this for him or herself, or himself, whatever label we want to give to that child in terms of their gender? Or is it the parent's decision? And so that's a legal matter that's been discussed and debated. Of course, psychologically, there is the reality that in some cases that may truly be sort of a more permanent, stable identity that that child is connecting or resonating with, whereas in other cases it may indeed be something that's not so stable or fully decided, something that that individual may later change their mind or consciousness about. So this makes decisions about dealing with this kind of complex, and I think there may always be some controversies involved with that. So we want to be sensitive to each individual person and their own situation, to the variables and circumstances that may apply in any particular case. It's hard to make a one-size-fits-all judgment about how to address the concerns of those who identify as transgender. With that aspect expressed here, I'd also like to point out that there is, of course, the biological and biochemical aspect that affects how a person feels in terms of their gender as well as their sexual orientation or preference. So many people have pointed out how there are many different chemicals and things in our environment that could be contributing to an increase in these variable gender identities and in non-heterosexual forms of sexuality. Well, that may very well be an accurate observation, This says nothing about, of course, whether there's anything at all wrong per se about what's happening. So we don't want to pass judgment on any person or in some way invalidate their own choice of who they feel they are or their identity merely because we see some type of biological or environmental exposure as contributing to that. Another way to look at this is that the spirit or consciousness is actually choosing the physical body and the circumstances that are present surrounding that particular body, that particular personality and their family and culture and society and so on. So everything about that person that's affecting them on those multiple layers is something that the higher consciousness or spirit is aware of and may have intentionally chosen to help facilitate or foster this transgender identity experience. One thing to realize is that when a person is going through this type of challenge in life of defining themselves in terms of their gender or even their sexual orientation, often society is passing some type of judgment on that person, in some way rejecting that person or ostracizing them, outcasting them in some manner. And this really provides a spiritual test for that individual to really learn to truly value and appreciate oneself, to really have kind of an unshakable self-love, self-confidence, and self-worth. So there's the other side to that, that even though a person may go through those challenges or hardships, those difficulties dealing with society, it's kind of a refinement process for the spirit. So there are many very mature or very advanced spirits, in a sense, that could choose that type of challenge. So we can see it from that spiritual perspective as well. And then there's also the lessons that are present for everyone else who may be observing that situation. When there's someone who stands out from the norm of society, it actually provides everyone else an opportunity to reflect on their own identity, their own values, and their own beliefs about life. So when we see people who are expressing some form of alternative lifestyle or unusual identity, this can help all of us expand our perception of the universe, our perception of ourselves and the world around us. It can help us think outside the boxes that we may have previously been immersed in. It can help us really shift our perspective so we can let go of perhaps some old biases or prejudices that we may have had. We can learn greater compassion and understanding for others, and we can also appreciate the true vast potential that's present in creation, the diversity of self-expression, of creativity. So those are some of the positive potentials that are present for everyone, to the extent that we're open to reflect on those things. One thing to consider is that when you feel that you've been in some way ostracized or oppressed or treated as an outcast in some way, there's various ways you can react. You can feel some sense of sadness or anxiety or grief or shame. You can feel anger or resentment. Or you can turn that whole situation around and use it to remind yourself to learn to value your own essence to truly love and appreciate yourself, regardless of how other people may perceive you. Sometimes there's a tendency to become over-focused on trying to force other people to accept you. And sometimes we see this in society where people become very involved activists as part of a movement to gain equal treatment or recognition. And while there's a value to trying to foster progress in society, I would point out that it's helpful to be careful to not become overly dependent on those external shifts in society in order to feel okay within yourself, and to also let go of any resentment you may hold toward people who are actually not really ready to accept or appreciate you. You can't really force that shift in their consciousness, and sometimes the efforts to do that can trigger some type of backlash or resentment and don't ultimately foster or expedite the shift in mass consciousness that you're hoping for. So we can all learn to appreciate one another, to accept every individual as a unique expression of divine potential. I hope that this commentary has given each of us some things to reflect upon, to consider. And I would like to appreciate each of you for taking your time to view this video, and I invite you to watch some of my other videos on topics of personal growth, of healing, holistic health, and spirituality. You can also visit my website, which is phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. For now, I want to wish everyone a wonderful day. Namaste.